wanna talk? So let's talk. Yeah. Talk. You wanna talk? You gotta talk, you need to talk. News talk.
I talk, you talk to Solomon. I talk, you talk to Solomon. Yeah, let's talk to Solomon. Talk to Solomon.
You gotta talk, you wanna talk.
Welcome back, my friends. It's Talk to Solomon. StanSolomon here. My co-host, Chief Steve. My other co-host, Brent Johnson. And, of course, our guest of honor, Dr. Tues. I'm going to go through things quickly so we get more things covered. An interesting thing happened in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, the Prime Minister of Turkey said to the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, hey, Boychik, you took a boy from a Turkish couple and gave that boy in foster care to a lesbian couple. This boy's a Muslim. It is wrong. It is immoral. It is unacceptable to put a Muslim child with homosexuals because that's against the Muslim faith. Now, we do not know what the Prime Minister of the Netherlands said. He might have said, but it's moral to dress your child in a suicide vest and go blow people up? No. But at any rate, that's not the point. The point is that homosexuality has become the new way to show you're sophisticated. Now, a funny thing happened on the way to the party. 1.4 million Frenchmen hit the streets and said, how do you say hell no in French? Well, at any rate, hell no in French to homosexual marriage. We'll start with Dr. Tues.
Austin, I have to say that I was pleasantly surprised at that big turnout in France. We are always told, and I think I more than half believe, that the Europeans represent the sort of decline and decay of traditional morality and understanding. But for so many people to have turned out and to be protesting the destruction of the natural rights of family and the disregard for the natural basis of family and what is involved, I thought it was just very heartening. And I also thought, by the way, that we Americans need to look at that and understand that we're being railroaded in this country by a bunch of people who are working together to create the impression of a change in the American consensus on marriage that is a lie. It does not exist. And we should resist the temptation to believe that there's some stampede these people have created that moves us in the direction of surrendering that which is the primordial form of belonging. You know, you talk about your belongings, right? I often try to get people to see that the very first belonging of human life is that child belongs to me. That is my mother, my father. If you don't have those belongings, what makes you think that any concept of property is going to protect any of your other belongings?
Well said. I was just reading how they tear gassed the crowd, including children, 6 years old, because the governments throughout the world want us to believe. We just had a lady on, a doctor, who said that according to the CDC, which is as leftist and liberal as you can get, 75% of all teenagers and preteens, 75% have not participated in sexual relationships. And yet we're being told they all do it. It's a lie. Another lie. Brett.
Yeah, well, first on the homosexual issue, in the Netherlands, what they said essentially was that, the child was in this country, therefore we get to decide what happens to the child. The way the child was taken away from the parents, by the way, was some kind of an accident when the child was young and the child was hurt. So the government came in and took the child away. And this is where the problem lies, where governments are allowed to take children away. Allowed by whom? Allowed by the parents. You know, if your most precious possession, if your most precious, dearest thing is your child. Why would you allow some bureaucrat to simply walk in, show you a paper, and take the child away? Set an example for the child. Fight for the child. Defend the child. If necessary, violently. Because you know how I feel. I think that in the end, power is never going to concede anything without a violent revolution. And that's what it's going to take. In the Netherlands, in France, in America, it's going to take people who say, no more. I won't have it anymore. Until that happens, all of this will go on. The Paul Goebbels school of propaganda. I also want to make a very brief comment about the Cyprus situation that you mentioned at the end of the last segment, which was the Cyprus situation indeed is setting an example for what Frederick Bastiat described as legalized plunder. Organized crime with a badge is what I call it. But there is a solution if you think ahead, and that is that there are still some real honest-to-goodness banking havens, Panama being probably the best of them. That the Panama banks are solid, they are not going away, and the Panama economy is based on their banking secrecy laws, and they will not give out information about the banking clients because they'll go to jail for a long time. The bankers will. So you create something called a private interest foundation in Panama. You move your money offshore. Then the U.S. can't touch it. They can't steal it. At the same time, you get yourself some gold and silver as security, not investment, and you keep that gold and silver. And then no matter what happens, you have security for yourself and your family, and your money is safe outside of the U.S., and you can still access it through ATMs and things like that. There are solutions.
That's assuming, of course, you have firearms, because without those, they'll take them all. Chief.
A couple of points. First of all, if you oppose homosexual marriage, or like in this case, if you oppose a homosexual adoption, doesn't mean that you hate homosexuals. So while in society there are some things that we tolerate, doesn't mean that we should promote them, on the other hand. But traditional marriage and traditional families, it should not be a political issue. It's a civilization issue. Since the beginning of time, traditional marriage, traditional families have shown to be the stabilization, the glue, for an example, of what holds societies together. And while I would commend anybody that would try and raise a child and protect a child, history has shown us that traditional families are the best place for children to grow up to become successful and good members of society. So if we want society to continue, we need to promote traditional marriage and traditional families. But if we do oppose homosexual marriage or homosexual adoptions, doesn't mean that we're homophobes.
Well, speak for yourself. I can't stand the thought, the idea, the concept of homosexuality. Now, that doesn't mean I hate a human being. God made him, that God's a lot smarter than I am. But I don't think I'm showing love for anyone if I encourage them or enable them or stand silently while they do something that's going to kill them. And the average homosexual lives half of the adult life of the average heterosexual. Fact. Fact. Now, if you love someone, do you enable them, encourage them, or stand silently by while they do drugs, while they smoke, while they swim with sharks, while they drive while drunk? Hell no. So don't tell me that I got to say nothing. Again, God made you. You're as good as I am. I'm not arguing that point. I'm saying I care enough that I'm going to say to you, if you get involved in that lifestyle, it's harmful to you, it's harmful to others, and I'm going to do my best to show love by giving you information. Am I off on that, Dr. Keys?
Well, no, but I do think that I at least feel like we have to be careful to make it clear that though I believe that God made people who say that they are homosexual, it is certainly a point of controversy whether God made them homosexuals. And I know that that is something that for a time there, people were claiming this. I think it became more and more difficult to try to sustain it on any scientific basis. And I often try to explain to folks that in any case, I'm not sure that it would be necessary proof of the point. Because the reason that marriage between a man and a woman has a certain privileged status is that it serves a natural function, not just for the satisfaction of the individuals, but for the perpetuation of the species as a whole. And that includes a due regard for the welfare of the individual child, who is going to be cared for by the parents, and a due regard for the well-being of the whole species, the whole human race. So it is a wonderful paradigm for the exercise of a right that at one and the same time serves the individual and serves the common good. And that's why in some ways it's the archetypal natural right. It also involves an element of consent, because as parents take care of the helpless baby, it sure isn't the power of the helpless baby, the armies of the helpless baby, the threats and laws of the helpless baby that get them to do what they do. They voluntarily give service, better than most emperors and kings ever got, to that child on account of what God has placed on their heart and in their conscience with respect to that relationship. So I think it's the paradigm of government by consent, where people are shown the right way, choose to do the right thing, and so submit themselves with a will and with love to the law by which God helps to preserve both them and the species and the individuals who compose the species. It's really beautiful. And one final word. We all get caught up in the discussion of the ill effects of homosexuality, the behavior involved, and so forth. When we speak of natural rights, we're talking about something that involves some of that, but also transcends it. Because we're talking about a right is something that is seen, endowed by God, and God understands the relationship between each and every individual and individual right and the good of the whole. And so when you're dealing with these things at the level of public policy, of natural rights, of constitutional rights, you can't do what Portman did and people like this. They stand up and say, well, because my son, my daughter, my this, my that, they're homosexuals, therefore I do this. No, because your job is to take account of the common good. And if you don't, if you go down a road that satisfies your personal predilections and relationships and sacrifices the common good of the country, including the elementary institution by which its civilization is sustained, then you're not only derelict in your public duty, you are abandoning your obligation as a human being. And frankly, people throw around words like crime against humanity. I think that kind of disregard for the God-endowed natural rights of human beings is the archetype of all crimes against humanity. And I think we have an entire elite faction that is now committed to committing such a crime against the American people.
I couldn't agree with you more. All right, I want to bring up drones. I talked about it earlier. When we first talked about the killing of al-Awlaki, or whatever that guy's name was, a lot of people were glad to see him dead. I was glad to see him dead. And the discussion was, should we be able to use drones to kill our enemies? Well, that was yes. You use whatever means you need to kill your enemies. But then a funny thing happened. This enemy was an American citizen. Americans are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among them is a right to a trial, if possible. And of course, al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son, who probably favored his dad's positions, I'm going to presume, he was killed too. To our knowledge, he hadn't committed any crimes. Now, at the time they took a survey, and this was the Washington Post, and they said 65% were for using drones, 26% were against using it to kill American citizens involved in terrorism abroad. That same Washington Post, so the same people, took the poll again a year later, and now it's, instead of 26% against it, 52% are against it. Instead of 65% for it, 41% are for it. There's been a major move. Now, I only mention this because if we will aggressively discuss, talk about, address, protest, whatever, as Brent has said, we can move the needle. That's the point I'm trying to make. Brent? Have we got Brent?
I think, yeah, I'm right here.
Okay.
I think that the point about the change in the polls, that means relatively little to me, because I know that polls can be manipulated and such. But what has changed is that the discussion has become more public on the issue. With Rand Paul and what he did a few weeks ago, the discussion on the drones has become much, much more at the forefront. When the question was originally asked, probably most people were thinking, well, we're talking about Muslim terrorists who go out with suicide bombs and blow people up. Today, it's a very common discussion among most people in the mainstream that there are considerations for killing Americans with these drones. Personally, I think that, I'd rather see no drones at all. But once the technology is created, it exists. And once it exists, you can't unexist it. You can't pretend that, gunpowder wasn't created. You can't go back to that time. So I think that it's good that it's more of a mainstream discussion. I still don't trust that the politicians are going to do anything different, because their goal, like Alan said so eloquently, their goal is to subvert everybody and turn it into a country of serfs. And to that end, drone technology is a good Death Star threat, if you will. Interesting point, however, there is a company in Oregon that has created a defense against drones, and they're actually selling it to the public. They're going to be offering it to the public. Now, it's intended to defend against drone surveillance, not drone assassination. But the technology is being created to stand up against the drones, to make it impossible for the drones to do their dastardly deeds. And so, there's something there, and I'm hoping that others will be out there expanding on that technology.
Chief?
Well, part of the mission of our government is supposed to be to keep our country safe from enemies. And anyone who knows a wounded veteran or has seen the commercials on TV that show wounded veterans with their arms and legs blown off, if we have any kind of technology that can send something to defeat our enemies and keep Americans out of harm's way, I'm all for that. I believe that most Americans like the idea we can use a drone to kill our enemies, but they now have disdain for the method that we use to identify the terrorists and who gets to pull the trigger. And so if we have a drone that can kill enemies, but the people responsible for deciding who and how and when is a political action committee in the White House, the Americans are opposed to that. If we have the right group of people that can identify who a terrorist is, what terrorism is, and when to pull the trigger, I think that would be acceptable to everybody in America.
Well, I think you've hit it exactly. I do not trust Barack Obama or anyone affiliated with him with change for a quarter. I wouldn't leave him alone in a room with a shower curtain and toilet paper, because I don't think he knows the difference or cares. And I believe that the concern that Americans have, and other people around the world, is that when asked, their idea of quote-unquote, as Brent said before, terrorism is someone having a bad thought, someone possibly maybe going to think about. They have no constraints, and America was built on the idea that we are constrained by two things: morality and a relationship with God, and a constitution. Alan?
Well, I agree with that. I think, as I've said before, I partly don't understand the fuss about the drones. I'll be honest with you. It's a technology like any other. Was there some difference, or is there some difference between sending a drone on an assassination mission and sending a highly trained assassin? Because I don't quite understand it. The individual at the other end, at the receiving end, will, with the right, if the right skill is used in deploying the technology, whether it's human resources or drones, that person's going to end up dead. And they will have been killed on responsibility of the United States government, right? the question then becomes, was that or was that not a proper exercise of government power? And that question has to be answered with respect to the Constitution, with respect to the laws, and finally with respect to the logic of our natural rights. Right? And this is something that I think, by and large, we have forgotten. As a people, we have forgotten how to think about our natural rights. We talk about them and so forth, and then we get all these absurd statements that are made, suggesting that rights are freedoms simply, and you get to do whatever you want and junk like this. No, a right is a grant of permission or license for an action from the sovereign, the one who has the authority to make that decision, and that gives us the freedom to act without let or hindrance from others who are subject to that same sovereign, because we are doing that sovereign's will and acting according to that sovereign's guidance, instructions, and rules. And a natural right, obviously, is one where the sovereign is God, and where the rules apply in our relations to all others who are subject to God's rule, which is all other human beings. And so when you talk about whether or not you're going to send a drone to kill X person, you would have to reason about whether that is a just or unjust use of power according to the natural law. And to make it just, you would have to show that that individual is somehow involved in activities that directly damage and threaten and harm, put them in an offensive position of harm, so that they are not innocent people, but people who are, in fact, in the process of trying to do you damage. Knuckere. Innocent means not harming me, and these people are trying to harm me or harm mine or harm those for whom the government is responsible. The mere fact that you're an American citizen does not protect you from the consequences of the violation of that understanding of natural law just because you have a passport that says you're an American. Cross that line, and you stand with enemies who are then going to be and are identified in the Constitution. Those are those domestic enemies, right? Which people are sworn to defend the country against. The last point you made, though, is the critical one. There are sometimes things that have to be done that require the kind of judgment, the kind of integrity, the kind of respect for who and what we are and are supposed to be, that goes to the very heart of what it means to be an American, to have allegiance to our Constitution and our way of life. It should have been unthinkable that the American people would put in place in the White House or any such position of enormous responsibility an individual whose whole background makes it highly questionable that he has any such allegiance. But the fact that we did so, putting us on guard as it certainly should, putting people in the Congress on guard as they certainly should be, so that they shouldn't be hesitating to impeach when that is required to get to the facts of Benghazi and other episodes like this. They need to do this because the mistake has been made, and we are either going to be vigilant or this country is going to be dead. But the fact that we are in this position shouldn't then make us want some general rule that ties the hands of our executives and our defenders against doing things that may properly be necessary to defend us, to defend our Constitution, to defend our country and our way of life.
I agree, and we're out of time, unfortunately. I just want to do a quick around the horn with some thoughts on where we are and where we're going. I'll start with you, Chief.
Well, a scary thought has crossed my mind this week. I'm envisioning the Supreme Court ruling that marriage is a tax, and we'll be taxed if we don't marry homosexuals. So we'll see what our congressmen do when that happens.
God help us.
Brent.
I want to acknowledge Alan for his appropriate use of the term banksters. Thank you, Alan. And,
thank you.
Just a final comment on the drone issue. You know, we as a country have been able to defend the country without the use of drones. We did it for quite a long time before drones came around. So just because we can do something with the new technology doesn't mean that we have shown the responsibility to use that technology. Just something to think about.
Alan, final thought.
Well, I just want to say, Brent, that I think that's a profoundly true statement that you just made. I think it summarizes, in fact, the whole heart of the concept of the real concept of limited government. That just because you have the power to do something doesn't make it right to do. And when you use that power, you must respect the right. I think that's a fundamental concept. I think we're losing sight of it, and as we do so, we're going to lose our country. We will regain sight of it if we return to the basic logic of unalienable rights, God endowed, that our country's founded upon, and I think that's what people need to work to do.
Well said, Alan.
Amen
Thank you.
to that.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Alan. And thank you, America, for spending time with us. This is Talk to Solomon.